Good day, viewers. Welcome back to the Preaching Humanist with David Oliverio. That is I. Back about, 25 to 30 years ago, probably longer than that. That's early to mid-'80s. The first church I started in the city of Waco, Texas, called New Wine Christian Fellowship. We rented out that little rat-infested building in downtown Waco. And one of my first recruits to Jesus and to the church was a man named Hal, H-A-L, and ironically, his wife's name was Faith. Anyway, I began to teach on biblical suffering, how it's God's will, the biblical God, of course, in the gospel of Jesus, for believers to suffer. Hal came to me after one of my sermons, and I'll never forget this, and it stuck with me and plagued me as a young preacher for years. He said, "Reverend David, I don't understand why I have to suffer. I've suffered enough. I was an alcoholic. I was a drug abuser. I was born and raised in poverty. My parents were abusive to me and so forth." He said, "I don't want to suffer, but you said, according to the Bible, I have to suffer because it's God's will." And of course, I told him I had to. I said, "Hal, this is true biblical Christianity. You must suffer. This is how we learn God's way." And I'll never forget. And Hal, you did good, and I hope you're free from this stuff all these years later. Hal looked at me and he said, "Reverend David," he said, "this is so unappealing to me, this being the Bible and the message of suffering like Jesus did." And of course, he never showed up again. Good for him. I wish more people could think like that. So today we're going to talk about biblical suffering. And if you're a believer today, listen to me closely. I'm going to ask you if this is appealing to you. Now, of course, the Bible, 1 Peter chapter 4, here's where this message comes from. Verse 12, "Beloved, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal you go through." In other words, this is normal. Shouldn't be surprised when you go through suffering. This is a normative for a true biblical Christian, which comes upon you for testing. According to the Bible, if you're a believer, God, the Christian God, will take his people through testing, much like Abraham and his son Isaac, the first 3 chapters of the book of Job, this fictitious narrative, otherwise known as a myth of Job. We know the story. Satan came to God one day and said, "Hey, let me touch your servant Job." And God told Satan, Job is a fair man, a just man. He loves me. He doesn't do anything wrong. He's a moral, upright, standing man. Satan said, "Hey, God, let me touch him. Let's see if he'll continue to live for you and obey you." And of course, God said, "I tell you what, I will lift the hedge of protection around Job. You can do anything to his lifestyle, but do not touch Job." The story goes on. It's horrific, by the way, that Satan kills Job's 7 sons, allegedly, and the 2 daughters, his livestock, his belongings, and so forth. Job's friends tell Job, "Just curse God and die. Get it over with. Forget this stuff in advance." Job said, "Blessed be the Lord God. He giveth and he taketh away." And then Satan came back to God and said, "Now let me touch Job." God said, "Sure, go ahead, but don't take his life." So we know the story. Satan puts sores and pestilence and disease upon Job and so forth. This is God's way to learn of testing. Do you need to be tested? And my question is, do we do this to our children? Would you do this to your child? Of course not. But according to the Bible, this is God's will. Now, verse 13 says, "You must share the sufferings of Christ." And here it is right here. "But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing." In other words, you have to share the sufferings of this guy in the Bible. So Hal, you were so right years and years ago. This is so unappealing. I don't want to suffer anymore. I want to be happy. Now, where do we get this idea that suffering is the biblical God's way and will? It's found right here, if you scoot down to verse 19. "Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God." It says right here in the New Testament of the Bible. It is the Christian God's will and desire and plan for a true believer to suffer. Is this appealing? Do we have to suffer in our life? Now, not long ago, I had dinner with a friend of mine. Her and her husband have been close friends now for probably 30 to 40 years, going way back in my Christian years. They're very strong Christians. We don't talk about the God thing very often because they're good people. And we were talking, and while our lunch, during our lunch, my cell phone started beeping with a text message from one of my clients, because I'm a personal trainer. This particular client goes through a lot of hard times. He has many physical ailments. He suffers shoulder impairments, knee impairments, and some psychological problems of depression and so forth. He suffers a lot. So I read the text, and a friend of mine looked at me and said, "David, what's wrong?" I said, I just got a text message from a client of mine. And I wanted to relay the message to my friend, my Christian friend, trying to get her to connect the dots about suffering. And I said to her, I wish that I had all the magical power in the world and perfect love and the ability to remove human suffering. Because if I did, my friend and my client who is suffering psychologically and physically, I would snap my finger and remove the suffering from this poor human being. And I said, I wish I had it. She looked at me and said, me too. I wish I had all this power, because if I did, I would remove human suffering. The sad thing is she could not connect the dots. I was trying to get her to think that this particular belief system, this God that she believes in and worships, could remove human suffering, but if he were alive and true, but he chooses not to. It is God's will for believers to suffer. My question is this appealing to believers? Let me tell you what true morality is. True morality is not following this book of pain and suffering. True morality is decreasing, is eradicating, is removing and eliminating suffering from humanity. This is true morality. And it is about increasing the well-being of all. I am not advocating and saying that we will never suffer. We do make bad choices. I can tell you I made many bad decisions, especially as a younger man, and I would say a lot of that was due to me praying and faithing instead of thinking. Sometimes we do pay the price and we do suffer because of bad choices we've made and so forth. But we can minimize suffering. Once you let these beliefs go that tells you it is your God's will for you to suffer so that your Father in heaven tests you to see if you love him or not. Unacceptable. We can minimize suffering. We can progress and bring about the well-being of all. That's my message. Now, stay tuned for part 2 as we will discuss, do we really need suffering to learn life's experiences, ethical behavior, and morality? Or are there other options, other ways to raise children without suffering and to learn life's experiences and lessons without suffering? So stay tuned for the next episode. So thank you so much for watching the Preaching Humanist. Have a wonderful day.